Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Becky, and I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be here with you this afternoon. A quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and a subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through secondary and further to higher education and beyond, and we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much, Joe, to you for giving your time to us so generously this evening. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £55 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. That's it from me. So now it's my pleasure to hand you over to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks. And good evening, everybody. Really very flattering to have so many people turn up at the end of a busy day. It's really nice to see you all. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Bear with me 1 second, and we'll make a start on. There we go. Okay, let's go back. Started in the wrong place. Okay, so good evening to everybody. My name is Joe Barber. I'm a fellow of the English Association. I'm also a senior lecturer and the course leader for the English secondary PGCE at Manchester Met University. Tonight's session starts with a question: is literary theory a thing in GCSE and A-level English literature? And I'm going to endeavour to answer that. I mean, I could answer it by saying yes, it is, and that could be the end of the session. But I think people would be slightly disappointed if I didn't explain why I think the answer is yes. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the theory part of this. And what I'll also do a little bit later is explain how my own interest in this question, a question that I've pondered for many years, in fact, led to me completing doctoral research in an area very closely related to this, and I'll kind of take you through how I came to carry out that research and what some of the findings were. All of that will combine to answer, I hope, this question, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so let's get started. To begin with, then, I thought, to kind of situate ourselves in the AQA GCSE assessment objectives. I hope this isn't triggering for people after a busy day at school. I'm sure this is information that you have to live by and work by, but you don't particularly want to be looking at 4:45 on a Thursday evening. But it's quite important that I do kind of take you with me on this journey, I suppose. So we've got the assessment objectives on the right-hand side of the slide there. AO1, AO2, 3 and 4. And AO1 is essentially talking about students being able to develop informed personal responses. That's a key phrase really for me moving through the talk today. AO2 is testing the student's ability to analyse the language, the form and structure used by a writer to create meanings in effect. So I'm going to be working with those two assessment objectives quite a bit this evening. If we just cast our eyes to the top left of the slide, we can see there the weighting of the assessment objectives. And as you'll all know, AO1 and AO2 are the most heavily weighted assessment objectives on both papers. And when we think about and look at the weighting across the whole GCSE English literature, AO1 and AO2 carry, they do the bulk of the work in terms of students' outcomes. So this is all kind of framing the discussion that I want to have really with you this evening. But in addition to that, I wanted to just remind us of the skills that the GCSE AQA spec includes under the heading of reading comprehension and reading critically. The spec invites teachers to develop the skills of literal and inferential comprehension, critical reading, evaluation of a writer's choice of vocab, grammatical structural features, and of less import for us this evening is comparing text. We're not really going to be thinking about that too much for the purposes of the talk. But I hope that kind of sets the scene really in terms of why I want to suggest that literary theory is very much a thing at GCSE and A level, because for me, theory is very much inscribed within AO1 and AO2. I see them as very clearly theoretically oriented. And I want to explain why in the next couple of slides. So I'm going to start with a model of the orientation of critical theories as devised by M.H. Abrams in 1953. I'm sure many people have seen this before. Abrams' original model, which I've adapted slightly here, was, I suppose, inviting people to think about the way in which works of art can be interpreted, the sort of coordinates, if you like, of how meaning and interpretation and critical responses can be generated. So I wanted to start in the middle on Abrams' model, because I think this is quite a useful way of getting a broad sense of what we're talking about when we talk about theory and theoretical approaches to reading and interpretation. So in the middle of the diagram, we have this thing called an objective theory. And this is where, for Abrams, he's suggesting that the text or the work of art itself will yield interpretations or meanings according to its internal structures, its composition, its form. So taken on its own, it would be possible for us to develop interpretations from its structures and its form. But he also suggests that further interpretations and further meanings are possible by considering the text relationship to three other elements, if you like. The top one, which he refers to as mimetic theories, refers to the text's relationship to the world in which it is read or the world in which it was written. So we could interpret a text according to the conditions of its production, the reading public at the time, reading tastes of the time, or we might, as we often do these days, and I'll talk about this a little more later, the way in which we refer to historical context as a means of interpreting what a text might be. Equally, we might look at the way that within the current historical, economic, political, social context, the text might mean something slightly different. And I think when I'm talking about this will ring bells with everybody in this session, where you think, yeah, I do that all the time. At the bottom of the diagram then, Abrams suggests that the text is also can be made to yield meaning if we consider its relationship to the author, to the person that wrote the text. And that might be by considering the author's biography, or it might be considering the author's stated intentions. The author said, when I wrote this poem, it was intended to be about X. And therefore we can say, well, because the author told us that, we know that it means X. So Abrams is acknowledging that that is a possibility, even though as the sort of development of theory, of literary theory, as it developed, expressive theories came to be seen as a much more inferior way of interpreting texts. It was ultimately a less satisfying or a less fruitful approach to interpreting what a text might mean. And actually, if we think about the role of the reader in that relationship between text and author, suddenly it makes the reader perhaps a little more redundant. I'm sure lots of people know the story of Ian McEwan's son studying enduring love for his A-levels and not getting an A. And Ian McEwan, I think, publicly said that that was ridiculous because he told his son what the text meant. But it's not quite as clear cut as that. And clearly, the assessment objectives were not looking for Ian McEwan's son to say, I can tell you exactly what this text means because my dad wrote it and he told me what he meant it to mean. So lastly, in the bottom right of the screen, we've got pragmatic theories. And this is where we're considering, according to Abrams, we're considering the way in which a text can mean a particular thing according to the reader's situatedness, the reader's own context, the reader's relationship to the text. So that, I feel, is still a very useful model for us to kind of orient ourselves with the orientation of critical theories. It's been developed many times. This, it's if you look for it online, you'll find lots of machinations of it where new branches of theory, lots of critical and cultural theory have been added to this diagram. So you can see even more broadly the kind of lineage of theory and its evolution over time. But what I want to suggest is that objective theories, that is the approach to reading and interpretation, which looks just at the text and its internal structures and its form. So, for instance, a sonnet, the way that we would really pay attention to the number of lines, whether it's a Spenserian sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet, whether it has a volta, whether it's got rhyming couplets, those kind of things that are kind of internal and integral to the text being what we call it, a sonnet, that we call that close reading very often, but sometimes it's called practical criticism, and I'll explain a little bit more about that on the next slide. But pragmatic theories, I would suggest, have come to be known as reader response theories. There are many of them. That's a big kind of umbrella term, really. What I want to propose then is that close reading or practical criticism and reader response theories are, in essence, AO1 and AO2. Informed personal opinion is what we're talking about when we look at reader response theories. We're talking about the reader's ability to develop meaning, to develop interpretations for themselves, but based upon the close reading that they carry out of the text. So the two things become pretty symbiotic, really. And I would suggest that those are the very theoretical coordinates of the GCSE AO1 and AO2. I had a conversation with somebody at one of the exam boards during the time that I was doing my doctorate. And the person who worked at the board that I mentioned this to said, you know, there's definitely theory in there, but it's up for debate what they are. And I was a bit struck by that because to me, it doesn't really seem like there's much of a debate at all. And I think whenever you carry out this kind of research, you're always doubtful that maybe you've got a bit stuck in your way of thinking and that nobody else sees it that way. I'm going to come back to that in a little while because I do think I challenged myself to make sure that I wasn't just constructing a sort of straw man argument, taking a situation and making it work to suit the problem that I wanted to present to people. So I want to suggest then that AO1 and AO2 are reader response theory and close reading practice or practical criticism. So what are they? Let's think and look a little more closely at what those two things are. And then maybe you can decide as we go along whether you agree with me and share those things towards the end of the webinar. So practical criticism. It was a method pioneered by I.A. Richards. He published a book in 1929 called Practical Criticism. According to Richards, who was a Cambridge don, who'd become very frustrated with his own undergraduates' inability, as he saw it, to deal with the structures of a text. And so he set them up for a bit of a test, really. He gave them a Longfellow poem, but he stripped out all contextual knowledge because he wanted to see what they could do with the structures of the text. And he was very, very depressed by what he found. And it led him to devise this approach to reading, which became known as practical criticism. And at length, he lays out what that is in his book, his 1929 book, Practical Criticism. But essentially, it requires the reader to prioritise the text that they have in front of them, the words on the page, and that they attend to its structural, linguistic, and stylistic elements, devoid of any contextual or authorial information. Now, that came to be quite a controversial point and something that came to be quite unpopular eventually, that context and authorial information was completely stripped out. And that's not really endured, I would say, that practice. But Giovanelli and Mason in 2018 wrote that practical criticism views the text as containing the potential for interpretation within its linguistic and literary structures. Chambers and Gregory in 2006, they make the point that close reading or practical criticism came to dominate classroom practice throughout the kind of second half, at least, of the 20th century, due to its teachability, as they call it. It was a very teachable model of teaching literary texts, very deliverable model of teaching literary texts and teaching the skill of critical reading. Gabriel Cliff Hodges, however, 2003, suggests to us that close reading could lead to pedagogies which rely upon the direct and one-directional transmission of knowledge. And I think I've included that quotation there because, as I'll explain shortly, partly what led to me carrying out the research that I did was because of the pedagogies that I saw, or the teaching that I saw, in lots of English literature lessons. I couldn't quite square the subject, what I saw to be its theoretical coordinates, with the teaching and the pedagogy in the classroom. And again, I'll expand upon that a little more as I go along to make that a bit clearer. But I guess it's worth saying at this point that I've seen practical criticism, and I still see practical criticism as a model for teaching literary texts in schools, combined with those mimetic and expressive theories, and that they often get quite mixed up. So often we've all experienced that annotating a text under the visualizer, paying close attention to rhythm and rhyme and a simile and a metaphor and onomatopoeia, enjambment, that all of those things will be annotated in the margin under the visualizer. But then I often see this strange combination of that with creating a comment to accompany the feature, which is actually more about the historical context or the mimetic approach to interpretation, or that it's given some sort of comment which is pertaining to the author's intention or the author's biography. Interestingly, when I did my research, and I mentioned this a little later, that tends to happen much, much more with poetry. It rarely happens with Shakespeare teaching. When I've observed teachers teaching a Shakespeare text, that happens far less frequently than when I've seen poetry taught. And interestingly, female poets tend to get that treatment even more than male poets even now, which is problematic and a little bit troubling, I would suggest. So hopefully that gives a flavour of what practical criticism is about. And I've also tried to just explain that I see that typically in classrooms as a very typical approach to teaching a text, but it also is accompanied by aspects of mimetic theory and expressive theory, rather than sticking to thinking about the effect of a particular technique or method on the reader. Okay, so let's turn to the reader now. let's have a think about the reader. So you can see there, I'm not sure if that was, it was all I could find. I didn't know how to insert an emoji. That was all I could find. It was kind of confusion rather than crossness. That looks like I'm getting very cross. I'm just confused. I'm a permanently confused person, I think, but particularly confused in this context. So let's think about the reader. And I've mentioned reader response theory, but in particular, I want to focus on the transactional analysis approach to reader response theory that Louise Rosenblatt was very involved in. And I think Louise Rosenblatt's work is really quite amazing. And she published a book in 1978 called The Reader, the Text and the Poem. And for me, it's actually really very simple, but very brilliant. In a nutshell, for the purposes of the brevity of this talk tonight, I'm going to kind of probably crudely represent Rosenblatt's work by saying that for her, a text is only ever a text until it meets a reader. So it remains a text until it has a reader to bring a lifeblood and a heartbeat to it. And when the text meets the reader, or the reader approaches the text and reads it, then the text can become a poem. It has that beating heart. Within Rosenblatt's schema, she puts it to us that there is such a thing as efferent reading, in which case the reader carries away with them meaning. They read the text and they carry away a meaning from that reading. But she also adds to that the idea of an aesthetic reading, and that is the effect that the text has on our emotions. And I think it's there that Rosenblatt suggests that something quite unique can happen. And again, I just want to touch base with those assessment objectives, informed personal responses, and the potential that there is for students to achieve well on assessments and in the GCSE examination by being allowed, being permitted and encouraged to really kind of tap into and understand what their aesthetic responses might be. I haven't talked about A-level yet, but the assessment objectives are remarkably similar. But one of the things that students are awarded for at A-level in literature is their ability to recognise that there are different interpretations of one text. And the work of Cheryl Hogue-Smith, for me, it's a really brilliant idea that she sort of wants to add to Rosenblatt's schema by kind of adding this idea of deferent reading, which is encouraging students in their writing to take account of other people's aesthetic responses to the text, thereby demonstrating that they understand that there is more than one way to interpret a text, and that arises from the aesthetic reading, not just sticking with the efferent reading, I suppose. So if I'm to talk about a lot of what I observe as a teacher educator, in my own students, I see them quite often get stuck with the efferent reading stage, and that's the goal for students, to take away a meaning, which is often an agreed meaning, or as Gary Snapper has it, a certificated reading, one that's kind of been authorised and approved and agreed upon, often by the teacher themselves, which potentially, when we think about that in terms of reader response, it starts to kind of marginalise or eradicate the reader's own aesthetic response to the text, which, according to the assessment objectives for GCSE and A-level, is where they potentially do even better. I will just add or remind everybody at this point that I'm not suggesting that what we want to do is encourage all pupils in classrooms to make merry with the text and fashion interpretations that they want to they prefer. It has to arise from that close reading practice of the text. They've got to have attended to the structures of the text in order to develop efferent readings and aesthetic readings, and potentially to incorporate deferent reading within their interpretations. Okay, so literary theory, I asked the question here, compass or country? It's a bit of an oblique question, that really. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Very often, what I encounter through my interest in literary theory as an erstwhile English teacher and now as a teacher educator, I'm always struck by the status and the place that literary theory has as a curriculum, an element of the curriculum. So what I've found is that literary theory is considered to be curriculum content, and that's what I mean by country. I'm kind of using this topographical or traveling or journeying metaphor here, that literary theory is a territory to explore itself rather than a compass that we use in order to navigate our way through the territory. I think it's both, actually. But what I found is that more often than not, if you pick up a book which is written for English teachers by English teachers, if it includes any mention of literary theory in the index, and you won't find many, I guarantee that you won't find much in the index of any of those guides. But where it is mentioned, it will always be referred to as curriculum content, something to the content to be taught. So I'll give you a session on Marxism, I'll give you a session on post-structuralism, I'll give you a session on eco-criticism. It's rarely talked about as something which is at work in the way that the subject operates and the way we teach it and assess it, which is exactly what I've been arguing for or putting to you this evening as actually being there. Chambers and Gregory suggested that literary theory is what distinguishes an English teacher's expertise and specialism. So they see that again as something which is a compass orienting the practice of a teacher. And Walensky, this is where I got the sojourner kind of metaphor from. That literary theory provides the reader with a geography of the page. It helps them navigate their way through the reading practice. I also found when I was doing my research that literary theory was the most widely studied unit on English degrees, but that was according to a survey that was done by the Halcrow Group in 2003. I wasn't able to find a more up-to-date survey of the most commonly studied units on English degrees, but what I did find in the QAA documentation was that QAA stipulated that for undergraduates, theoretical approaches to and debates about literature, literary and critical theories should be present in an undergraduate English Lit degree, that should still be included as a compulsory element of an English Lit degree. So all of this stuff was kind of going on in my head as I do my teaching of PGCE English students, and then when I go out into schools to do my observations and I observe these occasionally slightly weird and wonderful combinations of theoretical approaches to teaching literature, and it's just been kind of incubating away in my mind for a number of years. So I'm just going to move on then to kind of share with you a little bit, very briefly, what my thesis was on. And I titled the thesis, I'm going to tell you what this poem means. And that was in response to an observation that I did, not by a student teacher, it was a qualified teacher who proceeded to tell the students in the classroom what the poem was all about. And most of the interpretation was based upon mimetic, what Abrams would call a mimetic approach. So this is loads of contextual information about the text. You can't understand the text until we've covered all of this contextual stuff, or I'm going to give you 3 lessons on Charles Dickens or William Shakespeare, and that you need all of that in order to understand the text. So that's what I was referring to in this quotation. And it was a study of the literary critico-theoretical concepts in the practice of secondary English student teachers during their PGCE programme. I wanted to know how their knowledge of theory, of literary theory, from their undergraduate degrees, all of them had done a literature degree. I wanted to know what happened to that theoretical knowledge during the PGCE year. Given that I was seeing these slightly weird and wonderful things happening in their English lessons, I wanted to understand how that came to develop or evolve. Okay, so some context to my research. It arose from my observations. It definitely was influenced by the growth and popularity of how to approaches written by English teachers for English teachers. There's absolutely loads out there. I think a good number of them, in my opinion, slightly controversial, but I think they need to be handled with care. I think some of the advice is problematic, to say the least. There's some absolutely brilliant ones out there. But I think in terms of the stuff that I'm talking about here, understanding what the theory might be behind some of that literature teaching, they just didn't seem to have any grasp of there being a theory element to what they were doing. Very confusing mixture of approaches that seem to prioritise factual contextual knowledge. So a text means what we know happened in history. We're going to interpret the text according to what we know was happening historically at the time when the author wrote it. And it's a direct reflection. It's a mirrored reflection of what was going on, as though texts are a portal onto the past. And that's what fiction is, or that's what poetry is, or that's what a Shakespeare play is. And I also observed in my observations that there were very broad pedagogical methods. And, I'll lay my cards on the table here. I'm really referring to Rose and Shine's Principles of Direct Instruction. I don't dislike it at all. I think it's really, really sensible. I think it's great. I use many of those principles myself. But it did lead me to question, how does that work in literature lessons? And it took me back to Gabrielle Cliff Hodges' idea that practical criticism could lead to one-directional teaching, because I think that can also happen in direct instruction pedagogy. I'm an ex-English teacher. I taught English in 11 to 19 for 14 years, then became a teacher education lecturer. I've been doing that for the last 10 years. I've always been really interested in literary theory. And in hindsight, I think my English teaching, particularly my A-level teaching, was always quite theory informed. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back on it now, I can see that a lot of what I did was influenced by what I knew about theory. That was a book that I was introduced to in my first year at university. It's not the kind of theory that a lot of the students that I interviewed for my thesis were familiar with at all. They were very familiar with Barthes, with Foucault. They might know a bit about Freud, they might know a bit about Marx, but generally they didn't know very much about this theory that is often called liberal humanism in the UK, new criticism in America, and which I've come to describe in my thesis as textual theory, because they're theories about how we read and interpret the text. They're not big cultural theories, the kind of which we might see in the work of somebody like Althusser or Benjamin or somebody like that, which is the kind of theory that a lot of the students that I spoke to were familiar with. And often they didn't know what to do with that theory when it came to reading, which was an interesting outcome of my interviews. So my conceptualization of reading and my relationship with Rosenblatt's work was influenced by Freire's concept of the banking model of education, the idea that we see students as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge, and we bank that knowledge in them, and that we see that as our job as teachers, as opposed to Freire's idea of the problem-based or problem-solving model of education, all of which he kind of situated in this idea of a critical pedagogy that enabled particularly impoverished people to educate themselves out of poverty, I suppose. It empowered those people to break free of the bonds of poverty, I suppose. My methods were to interview 10 participants. I did 16 interviews with 10 participants, 6 observations, and took field notes, and conducted a focus group with all of the student teachers. And my methodology was reflexive thematic analysis. And the reason I chose that was because it was so very similar to reader response theory, in the sense that I had all of this data from interviews. And it was my job, I suppose, to tell a story from the data. I couldn't ignore what the data said. I had to be very accurate and faithful to it, but I had a story to tell that in part related to my own context that I've just shared with you a minute ago. So I I was constantly fearful that I'd constructed a straw man argument, but I always knew that I hadn't because of the assessment criteria for GCSE and A-level, and that kind of secured my fixity, I suppose, and my confidence in sticking with the project. My literature reviews led to me forming these 4 research questions. Does student English teachers' substantive knowledge of literary theory change throughout the PGCE? What concepts from literary theory do they bring to their teacher education course? Is it possible to detect those concepts in their progress? And what does the use or not of concepts from literary theory in PGCE performance, progress and assessment tell us about English lit pedagogy and teacher specialism in secondary schools? It's a slightly audacious research question there, quite an ambitious one as one of 4. It could probably be a doctoral thesis on its own, that one. Just to wrap up then, I wanted to kind of very quickly share with you the outcomes, the findings that I arrived at in response to those research questions. Now, I tried to make this as kind of condensed, concise and quick as possible, but I failed miserably. So I'm not going to read out the next 3 slides, but I am just going to let you have a look down those slides and get a flavour of the kind of thing that came out of my analysis of the interviews. So that's in response to research question 1. So I guess one of the things that I could say about this is that I had hugely overestimated students' knowledge of, familiarity with, confidence about using theory. It just wasn't there. In spite of the Halcrow Group's a report that said that it was the most widely studied unit on an undergraduate course, and in spite of the fact that QAA say it should be a staple of any undergraduate degree, the 10 students that I spoke to had encountered some theory of a kind. Usually they all referred to Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, but they couldn't often remember what it was about or what it meant, and often they saw that as reader response theory, which it kind of is and kind of isn't at the same time. So I was immediately taken aback by my assumption that they had quite a lot of substantive knowledge about literary theory. That was an assumption on my part. I found out through answering this research question that they didn't have much in the way of substantive knowledge of literary theory. And when they did, it was very different to what I thought they would have. Questions 2 and 3 I've put together there. So students often conceptualise the reader as an omniscient figure. And in my observations of them, I heard that many times. Teaching a text, what do we think the reader makes of that? So in terms of that idea of Rosenblatt's aesthetic reading, where does the individual pupil reader get an opportunity to develop their own emotional responses to, or their cognitive responses to what they've read, and can they learn from other people's ideas as well and bring that to bear in their own writing? I found that author biography and author intention were credible avenues for interpretation. I found that an awful lot in my observations and in my interviews with student teachers and their mentors, that it was a perfectly credible avenue to interpret a work of literature according to the author's biography or the author's intention. In textual theory, in a lot of textual theory, in liberal humanism and new criticism, that's not a terribly credible avenue. It's seen as a bit limited and a bit limiting, I suppose. This is another important one for me. The context was very, very widely used to interpret what books meant, what text meant, but often context just meant historical context. It didn't mean an interpretive context. It didn't mean a performative context. It just meant what was happening historically at the point when that book was written and published. And then this next one is really important for me. The inferential meaning, this very much goes back to the ideas of Freire and the banking and problem posing version of education. Inferential meaning was treated as though it was already fully formed, but concealed within the lines of the text, within the words of the text. And really it was their job just to get that out there. But what the text inferred to the reader, this mystical, all-seeing, all-knowing figure, it was already buried away in the text. It wasn't the reader's work. It wasn't the reader's job to create what that meaning was using the text. And text analysis was not considered to be reading. That was a big thing in the interviews I did. Do you consider yourself to be a teacher of reading? Do you consider, when you do all this analysis, you spend hours and hours and hours analysing the text and annotating on the visualizer, is that doing reading? And overwhelmingly the answer was no. It's either exam prep or it's just getting them to know the text. And text analysis was conceptualised as a GCSE exam skill, even in Key Stage 3 lessons. That was very typical as well. I would expect that some of this does look quite familiar to many people in the talk. And then finally, again, I won't read this out, but in terms of research question 4, there's quite a lot there as well. This is summarising a lot of writing, really. See, I did struggle to try and distill this without doing it a disservice. Some very problematic issues, I think, which are not easy to resolve. They are obviously part of a much bigger infrastructural issue around teacher education and mentoring and things like that it's not easy to resolve, I suppose. Okay, that brings me to the end. I think I might have overrun slightly, Becky. I do apologise. Those are my contact details. If anybody would like to contact me to tell me I'm wrong, I'm an idiot, I'm very open to that. Not so much being called an idiot, but I still don't quite have... I feel like, maybe there are people out there that could say to me, I think you might have this a bit wrong. And I'm very open to hearing that. I like to learn. And then I've just finished off with a bibliography of some of the things I've cited, but also things that I've referred to, but not cited, but were kind of key texts in formulating ideas and, what have you. So I'll stop talking there and hand back to Becky, and thank you very much for listening to all that.
Thank you so much, Joe. I have got several questions I would want to ask you, but you're right, we are about to run out of time. If I could take chair's privilege and ask you one question, though, in our last couple of minutes. We're in this exciting, I suppose, period at the moment where curriculum and assessment reform is very much at the top of our minds. If one thing could be changed in line with what you've learned in your research in the GCSEs in particular, what would it be?
That's such a great question, and it's very, very hard to answer. But I think just in terms of what I've been saying tonight, I would love there to be an acknowledgement that the assessment objectives are theory driven, because I just think it would be really, really helpful for teachers. And one of the things that comes out of my research is asking the question, expenditure on CPD for teachers has increased exponentially over the last 15, 16 years. I mean, hugely, but not at subject level, not at subject specific level. So one of the things I ask in the thesis is, who is going to take responsibility for that kind of CPD? If it's not being taught to English undergraduates at university, which it doesn't seem to be, does it fall to people like me on a 9-month PGCE course? Or should we be thinking about the way in which we can invest in developing teacher expertise in some way, rather than taking these very broad brush approaches to pedagogy and saying cognitive load theory is perfect for every subject, every school, every phase, rose and shine is the pedagogy of the day, when in actual fact it might have some limitations attached to it when you think about it in the context of being creative, thinking critically, thinking laterally, which our subject is all about, and developing those aesthetic responses. I'm not sure it quite can do the job there. So I'd love for there to be an acknowledgement of the theoretical coordinates or the theoretical flavours of the assessment objectives at GCSE and A-level.
Thank you so much, Joe. We have got a question that's live about your observations around the teaching of female poets and the type of literary theory presented. We do have to stop now, but what I'll do is I'll get you to answer that offline and I'll include your response when I send around the recording. So thank you very much, Sheila, for asking that question, and I will
Thank
make
you.
sure you get your answer.
I'd love to answer that, Sheila. You can rest assured I will answer that, I promise.
So thank you very much, everybody. I will let you go to enjoy your evenings, and I do hope to see you at another one of our events soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.